Greetings, everyone. Main points of the video. Putin has gone mad, and Crimea is turning into the Kremlin's deadly trap. The declaration belongs to Russia, forever to Vladimir. Putin is vanishing into thin air as waves of firepower rain down on the vital arteries of this strategic fortress, leading to an unprecedented survival crisis. The harsh law of geography in Crimea. From the biological warfare disaster of the Mongol army to the bloody cauldron of Sevastopol, the harsh law of geography once again proves that Crimea is the grave that swallows all ambitions of domination. The deadly avenue is under siege. Through a brutal campaign of strikes, the Ukrainian army has turned the Novorossiya supply line into a killing ground, tightening the noose to completely isolate the peninsula without launching a costly ground assault. Putin's secret escape plan. Amid the disaster of hundreds of thousands of civilians trapped in panic and running out of resources, experts reveal a ruthless scenario as the mastermind quietly prepares for a retreat in a strategy of shifting blame. Welcome to the Luan Su's analysis program. Before we get into the details, please take a few seconds to like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue. Thank you, dear audience. Putin bitterly gives up Crimea. The siege campaign cuts off the Novorossiya highway. The entire supply lifeline is cut off. Ladies and gentlemen, the declaration to annex the Crimean Peninsula in 2014 was once summed up by Russian President Vladimir Putin with a powerful statement. This land will forever belong to Russia from now and for all eternity. But time is the harshest judgment for any declaration of power. Looking at the current state of the conflict today, after more than a decade, the promise made years ago is now on the verge of completely collapsing under the pressure of harsh reality. Long-range drone and cruise missile strikes carried out by Ukraine are raining down on the peninsula with increasing intensity, directly cutting off strategic supply lines and pushing the entire area into an unprecedented survival crisis. The Kremlin's control has never been so fragile. Even the quiet moves to flee by Russian officials and citizens seem to implicitly acknowledge a bitter truth. The hope of holding on to Crimea is gradually slipping out of reach. Because history has proven that Crimea has always been a harsh strategic trap for any empire that wants to claim it as its own. Throughout thousands of years, countless global powers have set their sights on Crimea, raising the flag of domination, but none have been able to hold on to this land forever. History records the earliest invasion taking place as far back as 513 BC, when the mighty Persian Empire under the command of great King Darius I launched a large-scale military campaign and swept into this land. Then as time passed, control over Crimea continuously changed hands, from the Greeks, the Roman Empire, to the Byzantine Empire. Then in the 14th century, a devastating siege broke out when the Mongol army under the Khanate attacked the city of Kaffa, a bustling commercial center controlled by the Genoese, which we now know as Feodosia. The brutal siege, which lasted from 1343 to 1346, pushed the Mongol forces into a stalemate until a violent outbreak of the plague erupted right in the midst of their army. Unwilling to give up the fight and retreat in bitterness, the attackers committed a brutal and pivotal act. They used catapults to launch plague-infected corpses over the city walls, turning this place into one of the earliest instances of biological warfare in human history. That deadly barrage not only crushed the Genoese resistance, forcing them to flee on blood-soaked ships, but also inadvertently spread the terrifying plague throughout the Mediterranean and across all of Europe. What followed were centuries of sieges, military interventions, and both determined yet ultimately tragic resistance efforts. The most notable example was the Siege of Sevastopol, a historic event during the Crimean War, which lasted nearly a full year from October 1854 to September 1855. The Allied forces, Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and the Kingdom of Sardinia intensified their siege and bombarded the strategic port city with artillery. Although the Russian army bravely built massive fortresses and ramparts to defend the city, and the Allied forces suffered from disease, cold, and famine, the military balance ultimately favored the besiegers. The Russian defenders retreated bitterly, leaving Sevastopol devastated. By 1920, in the flames of the Russian Civil War, Crimea once again became the last stronghold of the White Army against the Bolsheviks. These desperate troops tried to hold their ground at the Perekop Isthmus, the narrow land connecting the peninsula to the mainland, to halt the Red Army's rapid advance. With a spirit of sacrifice, they sacrificed life and limb to buy precious time, allowing about 150,000 soldiers and civilians to evacuate by sea toward Istanbul. A tragic ending. But then, facing their opponent's overwhelming power, that strong defense also crumbled under history's heavy footsteps. World War II once again provided strong evidence that Crimea was not an impregnable fortress, but on the contrary, one of the harshest and hardest territories to defend in the world. In 1941, when the Axis powers completely cut off all land routes connecting the peninsula, the Soviet Red Army had to retreat and hold out in the port city of Sevastopol. By July 1942, the Soviet defensive line had completely collapsed. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or captured, allowing the Axis powers to impose their rule over Crimea. However, just 2 years later, in 1944, the Red Army recaptured the peninsula using the same tactics as the Germans, completely isolating the German army by land before unleashing heavy firepower to destroy Sevastopol. Although each event had its own form, they all highlighted a harsh rule that no great power or financial strength could overturn. It's the law of geography. The unique terrain of Crimea is both a great natural shield and a death sentence for any occupying force. Surrounded by vast seas on the east, west, and south sides, this peninsula has extremely few land connections. For thousands of years, the only way to enter or withdraw from Crimea by land has been from the north, passing through the southern territories of Ukraine. Moreover, even though it possesses certain resources, Crimea has never been a self-sufficient entity. Any empire that wants to maintain a presence here must find a way to continuously supply food, fuel, fresh water, and weapons to the peninsula. That's the Achilles heel, the supply lines. Throughout history, invading powers have always focused on cutting off these lifelines to exhaust their enemies. When the flow of food and fuel is disrupted, it's only a matter of time before the defending forces have to surrender or retreat. That bitter lesson has repeated countless times. Geographic isolation always precedes the collapse of the defenders. No matter how high the fortress, how strong the defenses, how deep the trenches, or how dense the bunkers, once resources run out, defeat is inevitable. And that ruthless law of history is now knocking on Crimea's door once again. When the Kremlin declared that it had fully taken control of Crimea, it seemed to believe that the hardest part of the journey was already behind. But alas, that was only the opening act of a harsh and tightening drama. Seizing a territory has never been the ultimate challenge. The real test of survival for any empire lies in its ability to hold on and maintain control. In a way, Vladimir Putin himself seems to be aware of the harshness of this historical lesson. That very understanding drove him to order the construction of a nearly $4 billion engineering masterpiece, the 19-kilometer Kerch Strait Bridge, connecting the eastern tip of Crimea to mainland Russia, opening up a new vital lifeline. He didn't stop there, as he launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Moscow's ultimate goal is also to establish what they call a land corridor, a direct road connecting Russia to the peninsula, by fully occupying the strategic regions of Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson. This calculation is simple but extremely ambitious. If they can control the entire buffer zone around Crimea, then no opponent, whether it's the Ukrainian army or the NATO military alliance, would be able to cut off supply lines and isolate the peninsula. That was once the strategic illusion the Kremlin fully believed in. However, the Ukrainian side deployed a completely new strategy, a method that strangely allowed them to isolate Crimea without having to shed blood to retake territories like Kherson or Zaporozhye. That decisive blow was called the Interdiction Strike Campaign, which erupted in early April 2026. By mobilizing large-scale suicide drone units, the Ukrainian forces continuously targeted the main transportation routes and logistics centers that Russia used to sustain the peninsula. The frequency of strikes targeting Kremlin military infrastructure increased across all the occupied territories. The main focus of destruction was the Novorossiya highway, a vital artery stretching from the international border deep into Crimea, which Russia has relied on for years to transport reinforcements, military equipment, food, and fuel. This very highway has now been bitterly nicknamed the Highway of Death by Russian soldiers and military bloggers themselves. The brutality and pinpoint accuracy of Ukraine's drone airstrikes have turned numerous convoys into burning heaps of scrap metal along the road. Meanwhile, Kyiv is set on blocking all Russian routes into the peninsula. They repeatedly shell and threaten the Kerch Strait Bridge and aggressively target ships, cargo trains, and the Shadow Fleet attempting to reach Crimea. Putin himself seems to have tacitly accepted the harsh reality that he has lost control of this strategic peninsula. Publicly, the Kremlin still uses its massive media apparatus to calm public opinion and downplay the scale of the crisis, but analysts see a completely different scenario. Igor Lipschitz, an economist originally from Moscow, in a profound conversation with Mark Vazin, a former Russian State Duma deputy and now a human rights activist, made the shocking assertion that Putin is actually quietly activating a plan to escape from Crimea. Lipschitz says the Kremlin is slowly preparing its military to withdraw and seeking ways to justify the defeat to the Russian public. The cruel part is that the Russian president will never organize a humanitarian evacuation campaign or ask Ukraine to open a green corridor for the hundreds of thousands of Russians trapped there, as pleading with the opponent for a ceasefire to withdraw troops would be a severe blow to the Kremlin's image. Instead, they may choose the cruel silent approach and shift all responsibility onto the opponent when civilian casualties occur. Lipschitz analyzed that from a humanitarian perspective, the evacuation of civilians across the bridge should have been carried out immediately, but that will never happen in the mindset of Russian leaders. Putin will calmly declare that the deaths of civilians are due to the brutality of Ukraine. He doesn't care how many elderly people or children in Crimea will die due to lack of medicine, power outages, or the collapse of the healthcare system. Because in his own war, ordinary Russian people are just pawns that can be sacrificed. The reality in Crimea is emerging like a besieged fortress, with fresh water running out, the power grid constantly flickering after Ukraine's precise strikes on energy infrastructure, and telecommunications cut off everywhere except around the Crimean bridge. Endless lines of cars inching forward to leave the peninsula have reached a record level. The Russians suddenly woke up in a chaotic and irrational situation, reflecting an extremely low level of public awareness about the reality of the war. Because it was only in the early days of summer 2026, when the harsh truth was revealed, that they were shocked to realize their fatal mistake. But for many people, everything was already too late, even though Ukrainian forces had never intentionally targeted civilians. Unlike the enemy's military doctrine, where civilian targets such as houses, hospitals, churches, or schools often suffered from bombings, the Ukrainian army focused their attacks on logistical arteries. Cutting off supplies to the peninsula unintentionally forced both defending forces and hundreds of thousands of civilians into a survival nightmare. A state of emergency was declared throughout the entire area. Local residents were banned from buying fuel because supplies had run out, while households and businesses continuously faced prolonged power and water outages. Panic quickly spread, turning the roads leading to the bridge across the strait into long lines of vehicles inching forward in desperation. On social media, countless cries for help, outrage, and warnings erupted, urging loved ones to stay away from the peninsula and openly criticizing the Kremlin's cruel inaction. Once again, the people have to bear the consequences of their leader's arrogance. Vladimir Putin could have easily deployed forces, openly acknowledged the reality to support evacuation, or taken a humanitarian action by establishing a safe corridor for his citizens. But he chose to remain silent, using the media apparatus to cover up the fact that Crimea is turning into hell. As Dr. Orhan Dogas, a Czech-Serbian security and international relations expert, sharply summarized in a recent post, the media can shape public opinion daily to make it seem like Crimea will belong to Russia forever. But empty words on television cannot restore the power grid, cannot fill empty gas tanks, cannot shorten the long lines of cars waiting on the bridge, and certainly cannot convince families to stay in a place where they have completely lost faith in their safety. Since 2014, Crimea has not simply been a piece of land. It has been molded by the Kremlin into the ultimate political symbol, a jewel in the crown, and an unsinkable warship that stands as proof of Putin's peak of power. Even when the flames of war rage fiercely in Donbass, turning Donetsk and Luhansk into battlegrounds, Crimea was still portrayed as a peaceful resort paradise, proof not only of the ability to seize, but also to maintain territory. In the Kremlin's vision, future generations of Russians will forever praise Putin's legacy as they enjoy the idyllic beaches along the Black Sea. Ukraine's intermediate strike campaigns have shattered that illusion into countless pieces. Kyiv is repeating the exact formula for victory, isolating the peninsula, cutting off supplies, and turning it into an indefensible Achilles heel. The field data says it all. The logistics network has collapsed, shipments have ground to a halt, and panic is spreading everywhere. All indications show that this disaster will get even worse as Ukraine continues to intensify its bombardments, with the number of attacks in June already surpassing those in May. The sinking of numerous ships from the so-called Shadow Fleet at sea, along with the ability to directly threaten the survival of the bridge, proves that Kyiv has taken full initiative. Once a massive military logistics hub and a southern base for Russia to launch missiles, deploy troops, and extend its reach into Kherson or Zaporizhia, Crimea has now completely lost that position. As Dr. Dragas pointed out, Ukraine has turned Crimea from a safe rear base into a space under constant threat. In this critical situation, the question is how Putin will respond. The usual scenario would be to fabricate stories about sabotage or technical incidents, blame the local authorities for incompetence, and finally accuse Ukraine of brutally targeting civilians. That's the tried and true method. Find a scapegoat to take the blame and push responsibility as far away from yourself as possible. This scheme may fool some distant observers, but it is useless against the hundreds of thousands directly experiencing Crimea's crisis. Families are left in the dark, running out of food, and unsuspecting tourists realize they've been deceived when they find themselves in the middle of a brutal war zone. So, in your opinion, is Ukraine's strategy of logistical blockades strong enough to force Russia to withdraw from Crimea?